Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Profitable Pastures 2025. This is our third and final webinar of the spring. I am Birgit Martin. I am the chair of the Ontario Forage Council. We would like to take the opportunity to recognize our conference sponsors. These are the sponsors for all three of our Profitable Pastures webinars. That is Beef Farmers of Ontario and Royal LePage, RCR Realty. And this evening, our sponsor specifically for our speaker is Ontario Sheep Farmers. And that brings us to our speaker for this evening. That is Christine O'Reilly. She is the Forage and Grazing Specialist with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Agribusiness. Her focus is on improving the productivity and profitability of forage crops. She sees a lot of opportunity for ruminant livestock farms to improve their margins through good grazing management. Christine joined the ministry in 2017 and is based out of the Lindsay office. So, Christine, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Birgit. Yeah, I'm excited to share this talk with you all this evening because this one is actually a request that came in from attendees from last year. Both of those are rather large topics, and we don't have time to go into all of the little nuanced details that make these different than grazing beef cattle. So tonight, I just want to hit on the number one most common question or biggest issue that I see when I talk to sheep farmers, and the number one that I see when I talk to are usually organic or grass-fed dairy farmers. Many of you may already have realized that a lot of the grazing recommendations we have in Canada were developed through research on the Canadian prairies. So while I think we've done a great job of adapting those recommendations to the wetter climate we have in Ontario and to the tame species that we tend to grow here rather than the native rangeland out west, sometimes we don't talk enough about how grazing different livestock classes or different livestock species can also impact what those recommendations should look like. So I'm going to dive into the sheep side first, and then we'll take a look at the challenges that are facing dairy. So with sheep, the number one most asked question I get about grazing sheep comes down to managing gastrointestinal parasite pressure on pasture. So if you take one thing away from this talk tonight, it needs to be that you can't just do the pasture part of worm management, okay? This diagram is taken from the Handbook for Management of Gastrointestinal Parasites in Sheep and Goats. It's a super long title, but it's a fantastic resource if you graze small ruminants because it outlines the life cycles of the most common worms that we see in small ruminants, and how to disrupt those life cycles, how to basically just manage them so that you don't see a wreck caused by parasite loads. However, I'm going to go into details on ways to measure the level of contamination tonight. But if you only do that and you don't implement the other 4 points on the 5-pointed star for the 5-star worm plan, you're actually going to have dewormers fail faster. The parasite resistance to dewormer can speed up if you only do part 1 and you don't do parts 3 to 5. So the thing that I absolutely need you to take away from this talk is that you must work with your flock veterinarian to implement all 5 points. Otherwise, you're probably better off just not doing anything and letting the wreck come when it comes. Because yeah, if you're not doing the veterinary piece on those other 5 points, it can speed up resistance to dewormers. So work with your veterinarian. Make sure they've read the handbook. I encourage all sheep farmers to read that. It is a little bit heavy, but take it in small chunks, and you can learn a lot about the parasites that can really cause issues in your flock. So how would we measure the level of pasture contamination? Well, very often, the first time this comes up on a new sheep farmer's radar or a sheep farmer who's new to grazing is when they are continuously grazing. So they turn the sheep out into one pasture, and they start having animal health problems. They might have some deaths, and it's because they have picked up parasite larvae grazing near their poop. Okay. So we can reduce infection through rotational grazing. And initially this sounds like the silver bullet. And the reason that rotational systems reduce that parasite load is because we're moving those sheep away from their fresh poop before larvae are at an infective life stage. Okay, so in those feces, we have larval eggs, and it takes time outside the sheep for them to hatch into larvae and to grow to a stage where they can actually reinfect a sheep. So if we move those sheep away, we can reduce the amount of larvae that the sheep pick up. How fast do we have to move them? It depends on which species of gastrointestinal parasites we're concerned about, but homuncus tends to cause the biggest problems for us in Ontario. And if air temperatures are 25 degrees Celsius or hotter, that homuncus goes from an egg to infective within 3 days. So if it's hot out, those sheep need to be moving at least every 3 days, if not more frequently, to stay ahead of the worm burden. Okay? Where things start to get a little bit shaky is that because we have that humid climate I mentioned just a minute ago, normally because of the grass growth, we get 3 to 5 rotations across a pasture in a year. So those sheep are coming back to the same point in the pasture between 3 and 5 times. And those multiple passes over the same ground also build up the parasite population on the pasture. So while rotational grazing is foundational to give us tools to help manage how much of an infection the sheep can pick up, it cannot be our only strategy. We have to do a few additional things on top of just simply rotational grazing to help keep parasite burdens low in the sheep. The first way that we can help reduce that infection is to lengthen the rest period that each paddock gets. Okay, so we know that we need to move those sheep away, ideally about every 3 days. But we also know that generally by the time the grasses have regrown, so between 21 to 60 days, depending on the time of year, usually that's prime time to have a lot of infective worm larvae back in that same paddock. So one of the easiest ways to lengthen the rest period is instead of giving the sheep a few very large paddocks with way more forage than they could eat in that 3-day period, it's often more helpful to subdivide those large paddocks and only give them as much grass as they can eat in the amount of time they're going to be there. So if we're aiming to move them every 3 days, we only want to give them 3 days worth of forage in each paddock. So that's the first step to get a longer rest period. The more little paddocks we have, the easier it is to have a longer rest period. But often just with the size of farms, that's still not quite enough to keep ahead to have the rest period long enough that the number of infective larvae is coming back down. So there are some other strategies that sheep farmers implement to help manage that infection rate. One of the easiest ones to implement, if your terrain and your topography allows, is to alternate haying and grazing. So in some of your paddocks, the sheep would go in and graze in the early spring at the time you would normally turn them out to graze. And then once you've got enough growth to kind of get out there and the fields will hold the equipment, you're going to take some other paddocks and harvest them as probably baleage, could be haylage. It might be a little too early for dry hay just yet. Okay. And then as your sheep are grazing around, once they've grazed a bunch of paddocks that have not been cut yet, then they'll switch onto the paddocks that have been cut. So the idea is instead of having a pasture that you're rotationally grazing and a hayfield that you're cutting as the crop recovers, both are both. So alternating haying and grazing means that you're still harvesting high quality forage for your sheep, but the length of time between grazing events has now doubled because in the middle is a cut of hay. And so that can be a great way to lengthen the rest period, make sure you still have enough stored forage for winter, and not lose the quality on those pastures. Another option is to alternate grazing with sheep and cattle. So this works particularly well if you don't have topography or terrain where you can get hay equipment onto some of those pastures. And the reason that this can work is that for our parasites that are the biggest problem in sheep, most of them cannot survive in cattle. So if the cattle eat them up off the pasture, those parasites can't complete their life cycle, and that can drop the population of parasites on the pasture. This approach does not work if you graze the sheep and cattle together as a mixed flock plus herd, because when the sheep are still in that paddock during the grazing event, the larvae are still eggs. Like they're not in an infective stage yet. So the cattle can't pick them up if the larvae are not infective. So that's why we want to alternate grazing sheep and cattle rather than co-grazing sheep and cattle. We do not want to alternate sheep and goats. They share the same parasites, so that's just going to build up problems very quickly. Llamas and alpacas also share these parasites, so they're not a good alternate one. I know llamas are sometimes guardian animals, and that's different. Grazing them with the sheep is fine. Horses are not hosts, but horses are the most difficult domestic herbivores to manage as grazing animals. So while in theory they could disrupt the biology of the worms, in practice, I don't think it's going to be viable to get the right stocking densities and the right kind of grazing coverage with horses to do alternate grazing there. So cattle and sheep are really your best bet if that's a strategy you want to try. If you don't want to have cattle yourself, maybe you've got a neighbor that has cattle and you guys can swap pasture acres throughout the grazing season. That potentially is an option. A third way to lengthen that rest period is to stockpile grass. So stockpiling basically just means we're going to let that grass get really mature and probably set seed, like my little dandelion icon in the bottom. And yeah, just give it the really long rest period we need to help get past that infective window with the parasites. This does mean that your forage quality is going to be lower. Now, sheep are excellent at sorting, but they will dive right down to the bottom of that canopy to get that new growth that might be coming up under the stockpiled grass. And we'll talk about why that may not be the best approach in a moment. So those are kind of 3 additional ways to lengthen the rest period that sheep farmers definitely use in Ontario. So I talked about going right down into the bottom of that stand to get new regrowth and fresh grass. When we're talking about grazing management, the word residual means the grass that livestock left behind after a grazing event. Okay? They're going to leave grass behind. We don't want them to graze down to bare dirt. That's not good for our livestock. It's also not good for the grass. Target residual is the amount of residual that the grazing manager plans to leave behind. So as grazing managers, we know we don't want to graze down to the dirt. We know we want to leave grass behind. And so most managers are setting a target in their head. They might not write it down or anything, but they kind of have an idea of how much grass they want to leave behind them. And when it comes to grazing sheep, we really need that target residual to be taller than 5 centimeters or 2 inches. And that's because about 70% of the parasites are in the bottom 5 centimeters of that pasture. So if we don't let sheep graze down into the bottom 5 centimeters, they're picking up fewer parasites than if we let them graze really, really tight. And when it comes to managing this target residual, a lot of times people want to think of it as an average. We know livestock don't graze evenly. They're not mowers. But having it as an average doesn't really achieve the goal when we're trying to minimize that parasite pickup. So ideally, as they're grazing down and they're starting in their most favorite spots are starting to get close to that 5 centimeters, that's the time that would indicate, okay, we need to move these sheep out and into their next section of pasture. This is easier said than done. The sheep love white clover. White clover grows really low. So I know that this is difficult to do in practice, but it is something to strive for and something to keep in mind to help minimize infection rates. All right, so that's the infection minimizing side of it. There's also some management practices that sheep farmers can do to decrease contamination. So spreading around those worm eggs and worm larvae. And really it boils down to 3 different categories. There's manure management, there's crop rotation, and there's managing thatch. So with manure management, composting can be a very valuable tool because a properly composted manure will have killed eggs and larvae during the composting process. So it's very important that we have a clear understanding of what compost is. Compost requires very carefully managing the carbon to nitrogen ratio of the material that you're composting, managing the moisture content of that material, and also managing the temperature, because we need that pile to get hot enough that it can actually kill eggs and larvae. Compost is not piling up manure and letting it rot on its own somewhere until you're ready to spread it, because that's not going to kill eggs and larvae. So if composting is something that appeals to you, then I definitely encourage you to go look at other resources specific to composting manure to actually get a good handle on what that requires. Because we don't want to be spreading eggs and larvae around on our pastures and hayfields, but the nutrients in manure are really great fertilizer for our pastures and hayfields. So it is a valuable resource, and if we can compost it correctly, it's something that can be used for crop nutrition. Another management technique that kind of gets bandied about when we start talking about managing parasites is breaking up fecal pellets. And this one is kind of a double-edged sword. So when our sheep poop out on the pasture, there are worm eggs in that poop pellet. And if we expose those eggs to UV light and to high temperatures, then yes, we can kill them. However, once those eggs hatch into larvae and start developing through a few larval stages before they become infective, breaking up the fecal pellets, those infective larvae are actually much more resilient against high temperatures and UV light. So if we get it early, we can kill the eggs, but there is a risk that we might be spreading infective larvae around. So breaking up fecal pellets may or may not be a good option, just depending on timing, weather conditions, a whole bunch of factors like that. Sometimes people talk about using a harrow to break up fecal pellets. So kind of like the sort of diamond pattern one with the teeth on the bottom to break it up. And while that works great with horse manure, I'm not convinced it works well for sheep manure. Because when you think about it, horse manure is also fairly dry in balls, but they're kind of apple-sized, which is why in the old days they used to be called road apples, because you'd find horse manure on the road, and it's apple-sized. Sheep pellets are so small that to get a harrow aggressive enough to actually break up those pellets consistently, you'd be ripping up the pasture, which is probably not what you're going for. So I don't think a harrow is the right tool to do that. However, a high stocking density might be. So using hoof traffic, giving the sheep a very small area at one time, and using the hoof traffic to break up those fecal pellets may be a better way to expose eggs to light and heat. But again, you might be spreading infective larvae around. So this is one of those practices that may have mixed results. So stocking density is how much area we give grazing animals at a point in time. So for a single grazing event. And people often confuse stocking density with stocking rate. They're not the same thing. Stocking rate is how much pasture those animals have over time. So like over the grazing season. So to help you conceptualize this a bit, in a continuously grazed pasture, stocking rate and stocking density are the same. As you subdivide that pasture into smaller paddocks, your stocking density goes up, but your stocking rate stays the same because we have not changed the number of animals. Okay, so stocking density is that point in time, and stocking rate is the average over the grazing season, over the whole grazing platform. The other cool thing about stocking density is it also is a way of describing how those livestock are impacting the plants and the soil and kind of that landscape level impact. So one thing we know about how stocking density changes animal behavior is that as we increase stocking density, animals get less selective. So once we get above about 100,000 pounds of cattle weight per acre, that's when we start seeing very little selective behavior. Their distribution across the pasture is pretty uniform, and we can really see that animal impact. Help manage the contamination level on the pasture is to consider crop rotation. So when you talk to vets that really specialize in this parasite management and preventing dewormer resistance, they will talk about safe pasture. And what they mean by that is that the contamination level, the amount of parasites out on that pasture, is pretty low, so that it's safe for more vulnerable, more susceptible classes of livestock to be grazing there. Ideally, with a crop rotation or with a crop plan, you want to be planning 18 to 24 months ahead. And the first time you do a crop plan, it's, if you can, go out like 5 years to figure out what that plan looks like. And it's it can be a bit daunting to do a crop plan on your own. So I highly encourage you to sit down with your agronomist or whoever sells you your crop inputs, so seed, fertilizer, etc. Your nutritionist or whoever sells you supplemental feed, vitamin, minerals, whatever you feed in the barn. Get those two people around the table. Probably wouldn't be a bad idea to also get your vet at that kitchen table meeting and have the 4 of you hash out, okay, how much forage do you need each year? How much of it is coming from pasture, and how much safe pasture do you need based on, number of weaned lambs that you might be grazing? Are you planning to lamb out on pasture? Like these kinds of factors that influence how susceptible livestock are, and figuring out how many acres of safe pasture you need, and then building the crop plan around having that safe pasture. Because that way, you've got it. And the hardest part about this is always sticking to the plan. So having a solid plan, making sure it's realistic, and then sticking to it can really be a great way to manage those contamination levels on the pasture. All right, thatch is the other aspect that comes up when we start talking about managing contamination levels, managing infection rates. And that's because thatch in the bottom of a pasture traps moisture. And the way that those infective larvae actually get up to where sheep will graze them in and eat them by accident is that they swim up the moisture on the outside of the plant. So if there's dew on that plant, if there's raindrops on that plant, those larvae can move up. And as soon as that moisture starts to evaporate, those larvae don't want to dry out. They swim back down, okay? So if you have a pasture that has a lot of thatch, it's going to trap more moisture in the bottom, and those larvae potentially can move higher up the plant. How much thatch is too much thatch? If it feels spongy underfoot when you're walking, you've definitely got too much thatch. As far as getting rid of it, again, harrows come up, and harrows can be effective for removing thatch, but they do tend to also pull up some of the pasture plants with them. So it might take a bit of playing with it to get the right amount of and dragging action to go with it, because if you do pull up a lot of those plants, exposing bare soil, that can sometimes create a space for weeds to encroach in your pasture, and we don't want that either. So yeah, a harrow is one option. I know the turf industry uses mechanical dethatchers. Personally, I'm not convinced they'd be able to handle the level of thatch we would find in a pasture that would need dethatching. But if you try it and it works, let me know. The other piece about dethatching is that once you've gathered up all that dead plant material, you need to take it out of the field and figure out a way to dispose it. So there is that. But personally, I think the cheapest and easiest ways to reduce thatch and keep thatch levels down comes back to high stocking densities. So giving those sheep a small area at one time so that their hoof action is helping press that dead leaf material into the soil, where the soil microbes can decompose it and just break down that thatch layer so we don't have too much thatch trapping moisture. Okay, that was a quick run through in terms of the pasture management part on managing parasite loads on pasture. Again, please, please work with your flock veterinarian, because if you're deworming like normal and you're doing all the things I just talked about, you may actually create a resistance problem faster and have a big wreck. So both those things go hand in hand, and I cannot stress that enough. So that was my little crash course on the biggest issue for both sheep and dairy cows. My contact information is up on the screen, but I'm also happy to take any questions that you guys might have.
To start with, Christine, what is an ideal rest period re-parasite load versus the discussion that was had last night in the webinar about a closed canopy and light interception being at approximately 20 to 30 centimeters?
Yeah, and that's where that's where grazing sheep gets tricky, right? Because what the grass needs, what the grass prefers, and the parasite management usually don't line up. So these parasites have evolved to take advantage of those grazing cycles. So when the grass is ready and that canopy is closing, that's usually about the same time that the parasites are in an infective stage. So that's why I offered a bunch of suggestions on lengthening the rest period while still maintaining grass quality. So you could be harvesting that crop, harvesting that grass when the canopy closes, and having the sheep grazing elsewhere, and come back when it grows back again a second time and has that canopy close. You could put cattle in when that canopy closes, right? So to lengthen that rest period. So it is a big challenge. And this is why it's my most asked question, is because, yeah, usually when the grass is at that ideal stage to start grazing again, that's usually when we have a very high proportion of infective life stage parasites.
Okay, you mentioned composting, Christine. Can you suggest some resources on composting manure at scale?
I know that there will be some stuff coming out on the Field Crop News website, so fieldcropnews.com. I don't believe that information is up just yet, but I think we're expecting it in the next month or two.
Okay.
So stay tuned.
Okay, and then you talked about removing thatch. Would cattle remove thatch any more effectively than you mentioned hoof traffic from the sheep, etc.?
That's a fantastic question. I don't have data, but from visiting farms and observation, I want to say yes. Cattle, they're heavier, they have bigger hooves, they tend to be better at trample activities than sheep are. It can be done with sheep, but if you have access to both species, cattle might be more effective at getting thatch under control quickly.
Okay. Are there, there was a discussion in the chat about burning the thatch. It used to be a practice. Do you know of anyone doing that anymore?
I'm not aware of anyone doing that anymore, and a lot of that comes down to municipal bylaws.
Okay.
So safety of people, safety of livestock, safety of buildings and property. Burning is not necessarily legal in a lot of places in Ontario. So really check your local bylaws, talk to your local fire department. Please don't just go setting fire to your field. That could be very bad.
So getting onto the discussion of stocking density, Christine, you had the chart that showed the different pounds. Is there a stocking density for sheep that you can recommend in terms of where to peg it in that chart?
I have not seen a comparable chart for sheep, and unfortunately this is common. There's more cattle in North America, and we tend to get a lot more research on cattle than sheep. It's unfortunate because we do have a lot of sheep in the world as well, but that seems to be the way it goes. So no, I haven't seen a comparable chart. Because it's in pounds of body weight, I think that possibly that one may translate a bit better than some other types of recommendations where people try to treat sheep like mini cows. They're not mini cows. But I haven't had an opportunity to like really break down, okay, how many sheep per acre would that account to? Because eventually you do run out of space, right? And moving stock every hour gets a little bit insane unless you've got a lot of bat latches or like similar automatic gate dropping things to keep things rolling. So the short answer is I have not seen a comparable chart for sheep, but because it's pounds of body weight, I'm hoping it transfers better than some other measures might. I guess one other comment that I will make, I know that this talk, I really tried to hone in on sheep and dairy cows, but a lot of the parasite management stuff will apply to anyone raising ruminants organically as well, because our sheep sector is very limited. They've only got one, maybe two active ingredients in their dewormers. And also anyone trying to raise organic cattle, whether that's beef or dairy, they're also going to be limited in terms of drugs they can use. So those techniques may be helpful in an organic setting. And like I said during the dairy talk, yeah, any other animals that have a very high plane of nutrition, so grass finishing beef or grass finishing lambs, the advice on keeping that pasture vegetative is going to be really pertinent too.
Okay, we've had a question come in again, wanting to go back to lengthening the rest period. Can you chat some more about that, Christine? Like, are we looking at 6 weeks plus, 9 weeks plus? How far do we need to stretch it out?
The frustrating answer is it depends. And I know that's not the answer you want to hear, and I know that's been a recurring theme of frustrating answers through this week. But the reason that I can't give you a hard and fast number is that the just like grass growth rate and recovery time varies depending on weather conditions, so too does larval development. So if it's, let me get this right, I think if it's warm and wet, they tend to develop quickly and survive longer. So yeah, weather conditions can really change the level of risk out on a pasture. And this is why it's so important to work with your vet in terms of figuring out, okay, do you have safe pasture? How long is it going to take for that pasture to be considered safe? And like putting something into an annual crop rotation can help a lot. So if you know that, oh, well, it's been out of pasture and not grazed for a year or two or three, and we're going to stick an oat cover crop in because that's a very easy first time grazing a cover crop, kind of a cover crop to graze, like those sorts of things can really help give you confidence that you've got a safe pasture, but you don't necessarily have to break up a pasture to make it safe. So that's really where you need to work with your vet. And if your vet's not familiar with the 5-star worm plan or the handbook that it comes out of, really encourage them to download that and read it, because it was written by vets for both farmers and vets, but there are moments where you can tell it was written by vets. And so vets will be very comfortable with the very technical language, where sometimes it takes those of us that aren't vets 2 or 3 times through to start getting our brains around it. So work with your vet on that in terms of safe pasture and how long the rest periods need to be there.
Okay. A question has come up now with regards to pasture rejuvenation via frost seeding. Do you have any tips for post-seeding rest period, or the recommendation for the first spring turnout then after frost seeding?
Right. Yeah. So anytime that we overseed, whether it's frost seeding or drilling something into an established stand, those young plants are going to be a little more sensitive. So ideally, we don't want to graze them until after the crown is fully developed. So the crown is like the little bump at the soil surface between the stem and the roots. That little bumpy bit is the crown. So that first grazing of the year, ideally don't take it as tight, right? So if you've let the grass grow up and you're letting the livestock graze down, maybe leave more residual behind than you normally would, just so that they're not pulling up those new seedlings by the roots. So that's one way to protect them. Again, in terms of time, it really comes down more to plant development stages and plant growth than it comes down to days, weeks, months, which can be difficult because plant growth depends a lot on weather conditions.
Okay. There was a question about the pasture handbook, but Caroline has put that in to our chat already, being publication 19. Do you have any other
That's
resources?
that's the OMAFA guide for grazing, so that's just general pasture production. The
Okay.
handbook for sheep and goats, if you do a Google search for 5-star worm plan or possibly 5-star worm plan handbook, there are a few different places. I think Ontario Sheep has the PDF posted for free on their website, and there are other small ruminant focused institutions that have posted it. So it is free to download online. I think the most recent edition is maybe 2019.
Okay.
But yeah, that is available free online for anyone to download, and it's a good read if you've got small ruminants. Take it in small chunks, but it's well worth it.
Okay, another question about safe pastures, Christine. Is there a test we can do to establish safe pastures, or is that, pardon me, is that just a fecal score? What makes it a safe? What is the classification? Is there a test to determine it?
I'm not aware of a test, and this is why I keep saying please work with your vet because they will be able to take, what they know about parasite life cycles and look at what the weather has been doing and help kind of assess that risk because it is very much case by case. So yeah, there's not a test that you send off to the lab or an on-farm test that you do. It's a lot of weighing risk, looking at the bigger picture with the management practices that are going on, and this is why working with your vet is so critical, both on the rest of it, all the deworming protocols and all of the testing in terms of like the flock health stuff, but also making sure that they're involved in terms of the crop plan and how long pastures need to be rested or only cut for hay or rotated out or all of these other possibilities to make sure that you do have the right amount of safe pasture. Not every pasture is going to be safe pasture, and that's okay and that's normal, but you will need some safe pasture for example, grazing weaned lambs are a high risk group.
Okay. All right, I think we have gone through all the questions in the chat. That is great. Any final closing comments, Christine?
Just that we've only scratched the surface on sheep and dairy, and it was an interesting challenge trying to cram both of them into one talk that would fit into a webinar. But I had fun. I hope you guys had fun.
Okay.
Pro tip.
All right. Thank you very much, Christine. And we just want to finally again thank our sponsors for Profitable Pastures generally for all 3 webinars. That was Beef Farmers of Ontario and Royal LePage RCR Realty. And this evening's sponsor specifically for tonight's talk was the Ontario Sheep Farmers. So thank you again to those. Thank you, Christine. With that, have a great evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us.